Is the little horn in the book of Daniel the modern-day Antichrist? In Daniel chapter 7, he has a vision that is both awe-inspiring and terrifying. He sees 4 great beasts rising from the sea, each one representing a kingdom. But it's not just the beasts that capture his attention, it's something far more sinister. Out of one of these beasts rises a little horn. This isn't just a small detail, it's the prophecy's central focus. So what or who is this little horn? To understand who is the little horn, we must first need to unpack the 4 beasts in Daniel's vision. These beasts represent 4 great empires that would rule the world. The lion with eagle's wings, scholars believe, symbolizes Babylon, the kingdom that captured Daniel and the Israelites. The bear raised on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth, scholars believe represents the Medo-Persian Empire. The leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads represents the Greek Empire ruled by Alexander the Great. And finally, the terrifying beast with iron teeth, which most scholars believe represents the Roman Empire, an empire of unmatched strength and brutality. But here's the twist. It is out of this 4th beast that the little horn emerges. In order to understand this correctly, let's first get the structure of the book of Daniel right. Understanding difficult stories in the Bible is sometimes like doing a puzzle. You can either try and get into the details first, or you can do the borders first. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's exactly like a puzzle, because I think if you try hard enough, you'll do the puzzle, even if you don't start with the borders, but it is still kind of like that. Having a clear picture of the broad outline of the story can help us not get lost in the detail, and can also act as a set of guardrails to not draw the wrong conclusions from the book. So basically, in order to understand whether the little horn in the book of Daniel is in fact a modern-day future to come Antichrist, we need to first of all get a broad outline of the book right. Old Testament books are frequently not written in a chronological order, and the book of Daniel certainly belongs to these. We basically have this following outline. In chapter 1, it's kind of like an introduction, a training session in Babylon. Babylon and his companions are being trained in the king's court. In chapter 2 to 6, we have kings having visions, and then we have a very strong statement at the end of those visions that nonetheless God rules. So chapter 2, we have Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of a mighty image or a mighty statue. As the chapter unfolds, we see that this image represents 4 empires: a head of gold, a chest of silver, thighs of bronze, and legs of iron. The important moment in the dream is that the stone, we shall see who this represents when we look at the details, overcomes all 4 empires represented by the image. In chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar creates a mighty image. Now note the contrast here. Chapter 2, we have this dream of a big image, and then all of a sudden we have this king, Nebuchadnezzar, who builds his own image. The important part of the dream is that God is mightier than the image. He's the one who overcomes. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream, resulting in God humbling him to be like an animal because he first exalted himself and considered his empire all of his own making. And as we look later at this interesting concept of the stone that overcomes all of the other empires, remember these stories because they're meant to tell you what's coming or how that unfolds. Chapter 5, King Belshazzar has a feast, and he openly mocks and derides God by drinking out of the holy vessels taken from the temple in Jerusalem. This is followed again by Daniel being the one called upon to interpret the dream. Incidentally, this is an interesting fact of history. It appears that Daniel was the only top government official, kind of like a prime minister, to be in his role in successive empires, because he's in the Babylonian Empire in that role, and then he is in the Medo-Persian Empire in the same role again. And interestingly also, he's not only in both of those in this top role, but he also does not lose or corrupt his godly worldview. The Medo-Persian Empire takes over the Babylonian Empire, but Babylon remains a major city, even in the Medo-Persian Empire. In chapter 6, the Medo-Persian king Darius sets up another image, and all are forced to worship it. This time it's Daniel who's thrown to the lions. And again, it is God who overcomes the statue or image built by man. You see, so this is a recurring theme in the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. So one could summarize the first chapters as humans trying to build empires, and God is the one who overcomes these empires. In chapters 7 to 12, we have Daniel having several visions of what we would think of the end. The big question is, what was that end representing? In other words, was it the end of the Old Testament era, or was it the end of the world at large? Or maybe it has both in it. So chapter 7, we have a vision of 4 beasts: a lion on eagle's wings, a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth, a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, and a 4th, more terrifying beast with iron teeth, out of whom rises this so-called little horn that we saw in the introduction. The 4 beasts most likely coincide with the 4 parts of the great image in chapter 2. And so it's like a recapitulation of the same thing. Incidentally, the book of Revelation is also written in this style. Many people think that it's a sort of successive narrative of time-based events, when it's actually a recapitulation of the same thing from different angles with different details, which is a very common structure in Hebrew prophecy in that sense, and ancient documents at large, not just the Bible. Here, like in the image in chapter 2, there are important time markers. These we will look at later on. In Daniel chapter 8, we have a vision of the ram and the goat. Again, it's a recapitulation of the previous dreams, because it's all about details of those empires. And in Daniel chapter 9, we have this culminating Daniel pondering over the prophecy of Jeremiah's 70 years to the end of the captivity and the restoration of God's people back to their homeland. And again, we see this theme of the end recurring here. And of course, as I said, it's a recurring theme in the whole book. The big question is, again, what does this end refer to? So in verses 1 to 19 in chapter 9, we have, this is an intense prayer. Daniel's confessing the sins of his people, and he prays for restoration. And clearly this sets the stage for what comes at the end of Daniel chapter 9 in response to his prayer by the angel coming to deliver him this vision, or this prophecy, if you like. So the angel comes to him, giving him an answer relating, obviously, to his prayer. Now, the question there again arises, is it logical? We're going to look at the verses soon enough. Is it logical or natural to assume the answer is going to happen in the current or relatively near period to Daniel? In other words, it's about him, his people, and what's about to come to them. Or is it natural when you read the passage? Remember, if you read it without any baggage that you bring to the text, that's not that easy, because we often have baggage that we bring to the text. But it's best to try and read it without our baggage. So is it natural to assume that there's going to be a 2,500 year gap, and the promise has basically no connection to Daniel, his people, or his time at all, or even the connection to Jeremiah and the 70 years that Daniel actually referred to in the chapter? And again, we don't have time to read the whole book. I would encourage you to sit down and read Daniel 1 to 12 all the way through in one setting. so that you get a broad picture. It's a really good way of actually getting a broad idea of what a book is all about. Then we have this somewhat amazing and also cryptic 70 weeks. I don't want to go into too much detail to be lost in the weeds. I'm going to read the verses, and I want you to be thinking of this one question as we read these verses in a moment. This is Daniel 9, chapter 24 to 27. Should we read the 70 weeks of years as one consecutive block of time? Is that how it reads naturally, plainly, when you read it? Or should we read the 70 weeks as 2 blocks of time with a gap of 2,500 years inserted into the 70 weeks? Because that's one is a sort of past tense interpretation broadly without all the details, and one is the futuristic view. So if the futuristic view, as in Daniel, is about our future or our day-to-day, then surely we would expect to find it in this most significant of prophecy that's relating to God's people. So here we are, Daniel 9, 24 to 27. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and on your holy city to finish the transgression and to put an end to sin and to atone for iniquity, to bring in the everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood. And to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for the half of the week, and he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Now, as I said, this is somewhat cryptic, and there's an awful lot of detail in here. But there are some factors that are relatively straightforward to see that I think very strongly point in one direction. There's this statement called finish transgression and put an end to sin. To my mind, the plain, natural way to read this is surely speaking about Jesus. Put an end to sacrifice and offering. Again, this sounds very much like the work of Jesus. There is talk of an anointed one, and there is also talk of 2 princes to come, one at the beginning and one at the end. What if the anointed one and the princes to come are not one and the same person? It seems to me like fairly logically, especially since there is a prince, then a week, and then there's 62 weeks, then there's an anointed one, and then following there is a prince to come. The anointed one and the princes, I believe, are not one and the same person. The prince shall destroy the city and sanctuary. Sounds very much like what happened in AD 70 to me. The Roman general Titus destroyed Jerusalem. 2 million Jews were killed in this 3.5-year period. What shall we make of the 70 weeks? Considering Daniel just referred to 70 years in the book of Jeremiah, it's not too hard to recognize that the weeks here are weeks of years, which makes the 70 into 490 years, which quite literally takes you from the decree. Remember, this passage speaks of a decree of a particular ruler at the time. From that decree forward, 490 years, quite literally takes you to the ministry period of Jesus. Then this passage speaks of a strong covenant for 1 week. Could this again be 7 years? It sounds like it. Here's the thing. Most do think this is, whether you are a preterist or a futurist, believe, past or future, most actually do believe that that means 7 years. Jesus' ministry lasted for 3.5 years. Then in the Olivet Discourse, he pronounces 1 generation of grace before the destruction of Jerusalem. And finally, the actual time it took for the prince to come, as in, I'd assume that is the Roman general Titus, to destroy Jerusalem was actually 3.5 years. This is the length that the duration of the siege of Israel and Jerusalem actually took. So when Matthew 24 speaks of a terrible time of tribulation that is to come in the generation of the audience that Jesus is speaking of, it seems very obvious and likely that that is precisely this 3.5 year period, this half of the week that we're talking about in this somewhat cryptic passage. Now, what about the futurist view of the interpretation? It says the prince to come is an Antichrist. It has to insert a gap of 2,500 years into or in between the 69th and 70th week in this passage. Is that really how we just read the passage? And I'd recommend you read it a few times over to see if you can find that 2,500 year gap in there. Where exactly in the passage is the break of 2.5 millennia to be inserted? How exactly does this future version become a response to the prayer of Daniel in the first part of the passage? Whereas the past view quite literally does, quite naturally, because the first week literally begins to occur in Daniel's life. And the very first ugly, if you like, anti-Christian person who arises, who is the guy who quite literally does the abomination of desolation. In other words, he is a king who sacrifices a pig in the temple. And during the period of the Maccabees, the Jews revolt against him and kick him out of the country. So this all did actually occur in the relative near future of Daniel. To say it simply, the all-important question we must ask about the book of Daniel is the end in the book, the end of the Jewish age or the final end of all time? Or perhaps there are elements of both, but is the emphasis on the period of time that Daniel was living in other words, the Old Covenant era, or was it the New Covenant era? Finally, in Daniel chapter 10 to chapter 12, we have more visions, which are essentially more recapitulations over the same dreams with more and more gory details. Clearly, there are two more recapitulations with more detail, I think, explaining the end of the Old Covenant age. Importantly here, there is not a single timing marker in the book that explicitly tells us where or how a future 2.5 millennia distant generation or group of people is meant with the book. Let's go back briefly to the important parts in the beginning chapters of the book to recognize what is the real emphasis of the book of Daniel. The most important verses, I believe, in the first part of the book, if you like, they are key moments. They set the stage for understanding the whole book and they frame it. So Daniel 4, at the end, has a declaration of Nebuchadnezzar after he's gone through his 3.5 years of eating grass and becoming like an animal, being completely humbled by God. Nebuchadnezzar effectively bows down before Almighty God and confesses that the God of the Jews is the one true God. In Daniel 4:34 to 35, we have this statement: "At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven, among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?'" This is essentially a confession that I think it really very much tells us that Nebuchadnezzar has actually come to true saving faith in Yahweh. But all importantly, it is a summarizing of the entire history of man, that God ultimately is sovereign over his people, over his universe, his creation. And he is the one directing everything towards the final end where all knees will bow before him. In Daniel chapter 6, we have this exclamation from King Darius, who, remember, also built this image and Daniel was thrown into the lion's den because of it. In Daniel 6:25-27, it's like a retelling of a very similar situation. Darius proclaims God as Almighty. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. Now, in the moment, we're going to look at what I think is the key verse in all of the book of Daniel. And these two verses speak exactly into what that key verse really means. But let's really just sort of to get a little bit more of an understanding. We're going to look at a few verses in chapter 8 to understand whether the end in Daniel necessarily means the end of all time or actually just means the end of a period of time that also culminates in the end of those four beasts, this big statue that comes crashing down. So we're going to look at Daniel 8:17, 21, and 26. So we're looking first at verse 17. So he came near where I stood, and don't forget, this is after he's had the vision of the ram and the goat, and Daniel is frightened at this stage. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. So reading that in isolation, we as living in our day might think, oh, that means it's for our end of time. But you see, the context is given in the passage. In verse 21, and the goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. So clearly that sets the stage that the goat and the ram is during a period of time that Daniel is alive, and yet previously we just heard it was from the time of the end. So the time of the end must be a time that is appointed to the end in relation to those two kingdoms. So it's a time when those two kingdoms come to an end, not the end of the world in that sense. And we see this then again in verse 26. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. Again, if you read that in isolation, that could be any number of things, but the vision itself set the stage that the time of the end refers to the end of those two moments of these four beastly empires. In this sense, it was the Grecian Empire. So it's important to understand that we should not take a verse and read it in isolation. That is a general thing that you shouldn't do ever when you read the Bible. Now let's have a look at Daniel chapter 2 verse 44, which I think is the key verse that sets the stage for the whole book. Daniel chapter 2 verses 44. And remember, this is in the midst of the days of the first image that Nebuchadnezzar has, this big massive statue of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, representing clearly Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. The reason we know that it is firstly Babylon, because Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar straight in the chapter, if you read the whole chapter, that you are the Babylonian part of that image. And it says in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, and in the days of those kings, in other words, the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Grecian, and Roman Empire, not some too distant 2.5 millennia away future situation. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Now, clearly, that cannot refer to anything other than the kingdom of God that is being set up. And it's set up in the days of those kings. The only time significant in all of history where the kingdom of God was, if you like, set up, inaugurated, brought to bear on in the most powerful possible way was in the coming of the incarnate Jesus, his ministry, and his life, death, burial, and resurrection. That is the coming of the kingdom of God in its fullness inaugurated, and there we are told here, it shall never be destroyed, it shall never be left to another people, it shall break in pieces all the kingdoms and bring them to end, and it shall stand forever. So clearly what this is talking about, I believe, is what the Puritans would call a post-millennial positive future vision of the church, which I think coincides with what we see the many parables that Jesus uses in the New Testament, such as the leaven being the leaven of the truth of God's kingdom that gradually leavens the whole lump, or the mustard seed that gradually grows into a big tree, the biggest one in the garden, so to speak. For a deeper understanding of this, I would recommend you then, after reading the book of Daniel, read 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and view that in light of Paul's, if you like, simplest and most succinct eschatological statement. Now, I can hear all you exclaim, but what about the little horn? We didn't even talk about it. It's plainly false to think that this little horn is totally disconnected from the remainder of the book. I tried to give you a broad picture, an outline of what the book is all about, so that you don't go into a situation where a detail is removed completely from the story. The little horn is a somewhat minor detail, a gruesome detail, but somewhat of a minor detail. It's not the most important issue in the book. As I said, the most important issue in the book is this recapitulating theme of the kingdom of God destroying all of the worldly kingdoms. Like saying, he's a man who will come in a few millennia, has no connection whatsoever with the narrative. That's, I think, what the futurist demands and tries to say, but that simply is not how you should read the book, because it's not how the book is told. The story isn't told in this way in the book. But let's have a look at a few of the details that relate to this little horn. In the dream, he grows out of 10 kings, and he grows out of this ugly, beastly, what we saw in the first vision, the part of iron and part of clay, which is clearly the Roman Empire. The first vision, the second vision is this ugly beast, because the Roman Empire was the most brutal of all empires. During the siege of Jerusalem, the Romans crucified 2,000 Jews a day. If you think Hitler was the worst that the Jews have ever experienced in history, you don't know history. The Romans were utterly, utterly brutal. Imagine crucifying Jews at the rate of 2,000 people a day. So this little horn grows out of firstly 10 kings, and then finally out of 3 kings. He was the one who also most brutally persecuted the people of God. In my humble opinion, this most clearly points to him being Nero for the following reasons. All the dreams are recapitulations. They're all speaking of the same empires. We saw this, I think, and I think if you read it carefully, you will see this recapitulation occur. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, we have the very clear timing statement that says that the kingdom of Christ will break all of those 4 kingdoms. In other words, the kingdom of Christ that comes at the end of that 4th kingdom delineates the 4th kingdom to be the one that is during when the kingdom of Christ comes, which clearly is the Roman Empire. So the little horn has to be one of the people that grows out of that empire. We have also, I think, very clear timing statement in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, that we saw that this is about the coming of Christ and about a prince who will destroy Jerusalem. In the lead up to AD 70, there were 10 Roman emperors in a fairly short succession. In the final lead-up, there were 3 emperors in the space of 3 months. This is how much tumult and chaos there existed in Rome, leading up to Nero being the most brutal of them all. And Nero was, in history, definitely the man who single-handedly persecuted both Jew and Christian. He didn't really make a difference between the two. He didn't really understand that there was a difference. And frankly, I think in the early church, there probably was much little. In other words, Christians were really Jews that had just followed Jesus, because the early church was predominantly Jewish. It seems to me we have a very clear indication that Nero was indeed this little horn. Whether he was or was not, there is quite literally nothing in Daniel to help the futurist interpretation in terms of a clear timing marker as a boundary to say that we have to somehow insert 2.5 millennia into this book. Whereas we saw several of them that draw circles around the dreams that push very strongly towards this past interpretation. I'd like to finish by reading this central most important passage and think of the coming of Christ when you read these verses. Don't try and answer the details before understanding the big picture. I think this chapter screams out the coming of the Messiah. And don't forget, when you think of the introduction of Daniel chapter 9, Daniel is quoting Jeremiah because he's earnestly seeking the restoration of his people to, of course, what he thinks back to Jerusalem. And in the restoration messages of the major prophets of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, all three of them give these new covenant promises that are retold in several places in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Hebrews. In other words, there is very strong data in the Old Testament, not only in Daniel, but in all the prophets that Daniel is referring to in his prayer that leads to this passage now coming. It's very strongly pushing us in a direction to recognize that this passage here is about the coming of Jesus. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. But the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many. For 1 week, and for half the week, he shall be put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Just one final reminder, read again Daniel 2:44 and recognize that is the hinge upon which I believe the entire book hangs.
Aside, babe. Let a star do this. That's all!
That's all, folks!
Can I go home now?